Hello everyone, and welcome to or back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to address the question of whether or not The Elder Scrolls 6 is going to suck. About a month ago, I made a video about the very small amount of information that we do have on Elder Scrolls 6, and a huge chunk of the comments on that video were something to the effect of, since what happened with Fallout 76, and even more especially with Starfield, I have no hope for Elder Scrolls 6. This isn't just true for my comments section, as from what I can see, read, and the videos that I've seen on the internet since Starfield's release and the subsequent backlash, the consensus has largely been that because Starfield was seen as a failure, hope for the Elder Scrolls 6 is now at an all-time low. I can definitely understand that sentiment, as I agree that Starfield was a big letdown. But I also don't think that it necessarily translates to a complete loss of hope for the Elder Scrolls 6. Because although there were quite a few mistakes made with Starfield, I can also see glimmers of potential for the Elder Scrolls. In reality, we simply don't have enough information yet about this game to make a determination as to whether or not it's going to be good or bad. Sure, if Bethesda were to suddenly announce that the map for Elder Scrolls 6 is going to be procedurally generated, or that all of our companions are going to be members of the same organization that is inextricably tied to the main quest line, which were both major mistakes that Starfield made, then you would be entirely justified in being extra worried for Elder Scrolls 6. But I don't necessarily expect those are mistakes that they'll make again. There are a lot of technical issues with Starfield that make it, well, not just work, as well as past Bethesda games. But the core problem with Starfield is not just the technical issues. It's that the world that the sandbox of Starfield is in just falls flat when compared to the worlds of Fallout or the Elder Scrolls. The Elder Scrolls has some of the most deep and expansive lore of any fantasy media, period. And Bethesda tried to do something similar in Starfield in just one game, but they simply couldn't. Even though Skyrim was many people's introduction to the series, myself included, Skyrim is not Elder Scrolls 1. It's the Elder Scrolls 5, and it had over 15 years of established lore and world building that enriches the world that you play in when you're exploring Skyrim. And you can definitely feel that difference when you compare it to playing Starfield. The point that I'm trying to make is that in order for Starfield to have worked, they were going to need to make a world that was interesting to explore, not only from a gameplay perspective, but from a lore perspective. I did have some really great moments when I was playing Starfield, where I would find an abandoned lab that you could explore and find out that it had been overrun by the aliens that the scientists were experimenting on. Or that time that you can find a derelict ship that has a malfunctioning grav drive that's constantly switching between the gravity being on and off, and you have to use that to your advantage to get through the wreckage of the ship and fight the pirates along the way, finding the treasure at the end. But unfortunately, these moments were exceptions, and in between some of the best parts of the game was a lot of walking through bland open spaces and a lot of loading screens. Unfortunately, Starfield failed to be a world that players wanted to be a part of, which is kind of the goal of a role-playing game, to be a world that players want to be in themselves. Ultimately, though, I would argue that the biggest mistake that Bethesda made with Starfield wasn't with the game itself, but with their response to the backlash. Rather than simply ignoring the reviews or letting the fans know that their concerns were being heard, and that they would continue to work on improving Starfield, and that they would take the feedback into consideration for future games. They fell victim to the negativity, and they essentially tried to gaslight the public into thinking that their feelings and experiences with Starfield either weren't valid or were their own fault. After something like that, I fully understand why so many people feel like Bethesda will just go on to make the same mistakes in Elder Scrolls 6. However, even though I fully understand why people would think that Bethesda won't learn, and that it will be disastrous for Elder Scrolls 6, I still am not convinced that that's going to be entirely true. Even though it may seem like Bethesda doesn't take feedback from fans into consideration because of how defensive they can be at times, they are definitely still internalizing those comments as they work on their next game. For example, Some of the biggest criticisms of Fallout 4 were that people didn't like having a voiced protagonist. They didn't like the simplified dialogue system and the minimal skill checks that were used to handle quests in a way other than combat. Bethesda immediately recognized that those were legitimate criticisms, and they began to make changes already in the DLC of Far Harbor, adding more skill checks and alternate ways to resolve quests. In Starfield, they added back in traits, backgrounds, and perk-related skill checks in a way that I think works pretty well, and it's something that I hope they keep for Elder Scrolls 6. Now, obviously, we've already discussed that they introduced plenty of new problems to Starfield, but the point is that something that the fans wanted, Bethesda did listen. Bethesda is also aware that they've used up all of their goodwill at this point. In order to keep the fans that they have, and to convince people that have already left to come back for Elder Scrolls 6, this is really their last chance to do so. Sure, it's possible that they'll continue to ride their decline into the ground, but Bethesda is made up of real human people. People that I believe genuinely want to learn from their mistakes and improve. Unlike Starfield, the Elder Scrolls 6 doesn't need to invent a new world. They already have one of the best fantasy worlds in all of fiction. They just need to inhabit that world with interesting and new stories. And I think that's something they can do a lot more easily than trying to build a brand new world from scratch like they did with Starfield. Based off of what little we do know about the Elder Scrolls 6, it's likely to be set in Hammerfell or High Rock, or both. And I would venture to guess that its main plot will center around the Thalmor and the Adamantine Tower. Bethesda already has a rich lore, backstory, and all kinds of world building about the people and places that are probably going to be a part of Elder Scrolls 6. As long as Bethesda is able to write some new and interesting stories to inhabit that world, then Elder Scrolls 6 can still be a great game. And I believe that Bethesda is still capable of that, because I've seen nuggets of good storytelling, even in the far less interesting world of Starfield. But the story and the world building are only part of the puzzle. The reality is that Bethesda has a lot of new ground to cover when it comes to gameplay as well. The Elder Scrolls 6 cannot just be Skyrim's combat system again, with a new coat of paint and a new version of shouts, like they did in Starfield with the Starborn powers. It needs to have more dynamic combat that includes things like timing blocks, armor weak points, spears, and other new weapons and magic. I would also like to see a more creative form of difficulty rather than simply increasing the health that enemies have and decreasing the damage that you have, as it works in Skyrim. Something more similar to a Fallout 4 survival mode, where both you and the enemies deal more damage, and there are additional survival-related challenges that you have to deal with. In the gameplay you're seeing in the background right now, I'm using a mod for Skyrim that does essentially that. It's called Hardcore Difficulty, and it replaces the multipliers in Legendary Difficulty so that both you and the enemies do more damage. I highly recommend giving that mod a shot if you've never played Skyrim that way. There's been some speculation that Bethesda could try and carry over the shipbuilding and sailing mechanic, essentially sailing from Starfield, into the Iliac Bay between High Rock and Hammerfell, if that is indeed where the game is set. I think that could be a good idea and could add some more flexibility to the game, so long as we have the ability to actually take our boat between places physically, rather than it simply being a fast travel point, as it often serves that way in Starfield. I am all for immersive alternatives to fast travel. This is something that I think the game Assassin's Creed Odyssey does exceptionally well. Despite how massive the world of Greece is in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I never find myself needing to use fast travel. This is because with access to a boat and a fast horse that's able to follow the road for you and go straight to the map marker that you've set, you can have an equivalent to fast travel without actually having to use a loading screen or an unimmersive way to get from one place to another quickly. Personally, I'm not someone who is concerned about having perfect textures and lighting, as long as the game runs smoothly, but I do understand that that is a concern for many, and that's something that many fans are going to expect out of Bethesda in the next Elder Scrolls game. Ultimately, I still think that it's far too early to make a call on what kind of game Elder Scrolls 6 will be. Unfortunately, all we can do is wait until we learn more about it. I can definitely imagine a world where Bethesda keeps their head in the sand and makes another game that's mediocre like Starfield. But I do not think that that's the most likely scenario. I think that the most likely scenario is that Bethesda does make a great next installment to the Elder Scrolls franchise, because I think that they still have the talented and passionate employees that want to make that happen. And I think that Bethesda knows, as a company, that they cannot afford to make another game that is received as poorly as Starfield. But what do you think? Are you willing to give Bethesda one more shot to return to their bread and butter? Or do you think that they're too far gone and that they won't be able to make a comeback? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.